All right, we've got some people popping on. Most of them say Andosin.
Yes, they do. That's interesting.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for popping on. We are just getting started here, so we're going to take a couple of minutes just to allow, we've got a lot of registrations and attendees this evening, so we're going to give everybody a couple of minutes for the Zoom platform to get everybody loaded in. And so just hang tight for a minute and we'll kind of go through our house cleaning bullet points and then we'll give it off to the team.
Yes. And if you're looking at your name on the Zoom webinar and it says that you're Andosin, I'm here to let you know that you're not, but I am. So to clarify things for us, you guys can just click on your name and there should be an option to rename yourself, and you can rename yourself what your real name is.
You could, can the real Andosin please stand up? Please stand up. If any of you are Eminem fans, you'll know that song. If not, I apologize. I'll send you the video.
Yes. So if you've joined Sarah and I for any webinars or Practice Partner Academy sessions before, then you know the drill. We have a question and answer box along the bottom in Zoom. There's also a chat. So whatever you're more comfortable with as a user, you can drop in any questions that you have into the Q&A or the chat, and we will make sure that we get those answered. We will likely be holding all of the questions until the end, but if we start to get a lot that are, about a specific topic that we're discussing, then we'll pause and address some of those questions.
And don't forget to use your reactions. I'm a big fan of the emojis. And if during the presentation, if there's something that you think is just killer, you can do the thumbs up. Or if you just want to tell everyone how much you love them, you can give them a nice big heart. There are other ones there too. You can do your party if it was like New Year's. Yes. It is almost officially summer, so you can celebrate that.
So we're going to go ahead and get it started here in just 1 second. I just have one more thing. On your internet browser, when you opened up this Zoom thing, it redirected you to a basically information page where if you'd like more information or if you'd like to be connected with Mike or Dr. Levin or John Leardi, then go ahead and just fill out that quick form there and we'll make sure that we get you guys connected with them and get all your questions answered. So Sarah, do you have any other housekeeping things before we?
I don't think so. Like Ann said, just make sure, don't hold on to your questions. Don't keep them till the end to yourself. Type them in the box, and that way you don't forget anything that crosses your mind. It's also, you may even go ahead and start right now. You can put some Q&A or even in the chat. Let us know why you're here this evening. Tell us the reason why you have decided to show up. And it can be specific, it can be just a general statement, just so our speakers this evening have a good idea of the points that are really salient and important to all of you so that everybody gets, maximizes the time here. So you can just let us know what is really intriguing you about tonight's presentation and what you're really hoping to see covered.
All right, good. So I just got a message that said the chat is disabled, so I'm going to just check here and see if we're okay. If anyone gets my chat message, just go ahead and give me a thumbs up in your reactions. All right, good. Oh, I love it. Okay, good. All right, so like I said, we are here tonight with Mike Crosby and Dr. Levin from Provider Resources. They are being joined by, they've invited John Leardi, who's a healthcare attorney, and they're going to talk to us about things to know when you're interested in selling your practice. I get this question all the time, and so this is a much needed topic. So if you don't know Mike Crosby, you've probably seen him around. He is the 2023 Podiatry Management Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. That's a huge accomplishment. So congratulations, Mike.
Thank you.
He's the president of Provider Resources, which is a healthcare services firm providing consulting and brokerage services to the podiatric physician community. He works with doctors to evaluate their operating concerns and provide solutions yielding a positive return and improved cash flow. So with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and he's going to introduce our guests, and we'll let them take it from there.
Sarah and Ann, thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to work with podiatry meetings. I told them I was going to say this, and I'm going to say it now, and I'm going to say it at the end. Working with these folks, it really makes it easy. They do all the hard work. They got all the technology squared away. They get everything set up. I show up. This is the second one I've done with them. It's a long way from the last one because they do a good job of getting the word out, as well as all the technical issues that go with it. Thank you to them very much. And I want to express my appreciation for their hard work behind the scenes. Joining me tonight is Bruce Levin, who is a podiatric advisor with our firm. Bruce works with us, and he sold his practice in 2019. He's in Arizona. He was previously in Pennsylvania, New Jersey area before he went there. He does things where we need physician to physician intervention and discussions, as well as heavy on the recruitment side. But Bruce can talk. We'll be adding to tonight where some of the challenges and pitfalls and things that he noted while he was going through his process and selling his practices that he's done. And John Leardi, John's with Tachi, Leardi, and Werner. I got the first name close, but I don't know it exactly right. It's not an Alabama name, so I have a little bit of trouble with it. He represents podiatric physicians in both transactions and disputes. He's comfortable advocating for his clients in both the courtroom and the boardroom. As a multiple exit entrepreneur himself, John, he regularly advises podiatry practices of shapes and sizes and issues related to corporate formation, restructuring, and dissolution, as well as mergers, acquisitions, and spinoffs. I've been working with John for several years now. We work together on many projects and have found him to be reliable and a really great source of information. So I am going to start tonight with sharing my screen. I have about 8 or 10 slides. You're welcome to chime in at this point or as we go through this so that we can use this and have a time that you can ask questions as you see things come up for you. So we will get started with this. I've got something going on right up here. TV timeout. There we go. All right. We're going to take it like this and work with it. One of the things that we're talking about is we label this 10 key strategies and things to know as you get ready to sell your practice and transition. So as we get ready with that, we're going to look at what is it, and realizing that I'm from the South, a fixing to and a planning on, but you got to figure out when you're going to get started. And you want to set a time for when you want to start, how you want to get organized, and how you want to have a plan of attack to go into this. And it's something that takes time. Deciding that you're going to sell your practice is a process. Right now, we're seeing it take anywhere from a short range of 5 months to 18 to 24 months, depending on if you already have a buyer in place or if you're going straight to the open market and you've decided it's time to sell and exit at that point. The other piece of it is, here we go. The other thing that we're after is we're trying to set up an expectation of how this is going to work for you as you go through your process of understanding what all is there? Did you lose my screen? Because I did sharing screen and I don't know. Okay, let's try this again. Am I still on, Ann?
You need to share your screen again. And while you're figuring that out, I'm going to make a little announcement. Although Sarah and I try to be prepared for everything, we are having slight technical difficulties. I am getting reports that some of you are not able to access the chat or the Q&A. So I'm about to send an email to everyone. When you have questions, just shoot us a reply to this email and we will do it that way and keep things easy. So just to let you know, I'll be sending you guys an email in the next 5 minutes. Just simply reply to that email if you have any questions, if you're having issues accessing the chat or the Q&A. All right, Mike, looks like you're good to go.
There we go. There we go. So we've talked about it. And one of the key things is making sure you have a team of people to work with. This is not something that you want to quote unquote go on your own. And so my recommendation is meet with your planner, your attorney, your accountant, your family. Make sure everybody's in the boat with you. The one thing that you don't want to do is get going down the road and suddenly tell somebody that you're selling your practice and they didn't have an idea that was coming. And that's really not the kind of surprise that you want to land on somebody and have to explain. One of the early steps in the process.
Mike, if we could take a step back, with respect to getting started, I think a key point here is you can't start too early, but you can get started too late. And what do I mean by that? Well, as we start talking about some of the things that come up during the sale of a practice, and I'm sure Dr. Levin can speak to this far better than any of us, having gone through it himself. I mean, you are going to get the legal equivalent of a proctology exam. And so there really is no such thing as getting started too early. If you think you're even within 10 or 15 years of wanting to sell your practice, right? Or certainly if you're sooner in terms of your timeline, the time to start getting organized and getting ready and tidying up some things with respect to your corporate structure and your contracts and all of that is now, right? And I'll tell you, as we talk about, an advisory team, and you can't do this without a lawyer, and you can't do this without an accountant. And the first conversation you have with them shouldn't be about specific terms. It should be years in advance about how do you start getting prepared for this kind of thing, right? As you're going through your financials, you should be having a conversation with your accountant every year that's far more than how much do I pay the IRS this year, right? Or how can I save some money on X, Y, and Z? You should be talking about your financial statements. You should be talking about how you're characterizing income and expenses. If you're a small business owner, like most of us are, you're running some perks through the business. How are you reporting that, right? Because these are the things that are going to come up. And, somebody like Mike or, one of his counterparts, it's perhaps, on behalf of a buying entity, when they're looking at value, they're really going to scrutinize your financial statements. And you're not going to want to start fixing those things 6 months or a year before a transaction. So getting started is sort of a loaded phrase because there's near term and then there's long term preparation for a transaction such as this. And so, for some of the folks that are on here that maybe think that I'm years and years away, well, it might be a good time to start getting organized.
Good point. One of the things that we see is you own the real estate in a separate entity. You pay rent every month, but there's not a written lease. And so you get ready to sell and suddenly your financials change and it creates a lot of questions. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is one of the steps in the process is to collect and organize your financial information, all the way from tax returns, financial statements, accounts receivable reports, leases, payer contracts, all that begin to put in a vault, electronic vault that you can have and have access to and have it secure. But one of the things that somebody that's looking to buy your practice is going to want to see historical tax returns. They're going to want to understand the financial statements and how they relate to the tax returns. What adjustments have you been making? What haven't you been making? Have you run the business as an extension of your lifestyle, or is it a business that has transferability to it? Well, then you're going to go into it. So that you got all the information, you're going to have an evaluation and evaluation of your practice by a third party. And a couple of points that are really important. Practices derive their value based on the cash flow and what makes up that cash flow, what adjustments need to be made, how many people, how many family members do you have on the payroll? Are you paying people at market rate or below market rate, or somebody's a family member not being paid? You're not paying rent, but you own the building. So a third party, somebody new buying the practice would incur rent that you haven't been paying. That's the kinds of things that begin to surface as you go through that. And a description and explanation and understanding of that is at the top of the list. One of the things, go ahead.
If I could. So, I mean, this is the way you have to look at it, right? You know, a podiatry practice is a service-based business. You're not like manufacturing widgets and selling them to the general public. You know, effectively, the fruits of your labor is, you know, the most important asset of the practice. And how do we value that? We value it by how much money is a buyer going to be able to put in their pocket once you're not there anymore, right? And so if there are expenses that are not going to be carried on, or perhaps there's freebies that aren't going to be carried on, Mike used the reference of you own the real estate and perhaps you pay yourself either too much or too little in terms of rent. I mean, that's the sort of adjustment that needs to be made. And this idea of evaluation, I mean, I'll tell you now, if you're getting your valuation for the first time as you enter this process, I think it's a mistake. And what I mean by that is, particularly if you have multiple owners in a practice, having a valuation done every few years is probably a good idea, right? And so that you can track the impact of the various efforts that you make in the business on the value of the practice. But understand that it's, you know, a lot of times I'll get asked, and Mike, I'm sure you do too, and you know, you're certainly more competent to answer this question off the cuff than I am, but I get asked all the time, well, how much is a practice worth? And, you know, I've heard that it's 50% of the gross, or I've heard it's 1.5 times the net. Well, okay, well, there's lots of different quote unquote formulas that folks will be using out there, but it really comes down to is what is the state of your financials, right? Do you have a true EBITDA listed as your profit on your P&L? I'll suggest probably not, without some adjustments needing to be made. You know, again, you know, particularly for these smaller practices where, you know, you run sort of a benevolent dictatorship, it's your own sort of fiefdom. Maybe as you've run that business to take care of you and your family, you haven't had to focus on the formality of financial statements, et cetera, and making sure that they are impeccably organized and reported. But as you start to, you know, get prepared to sell, that calculus changes, right? And so you need to treat it more like you would any other asset or any other investment in terms of the formality with which you should be inventorying this information.
I know, Bruce, where did you start in the process? What, 2018, late 17?
I started around 2017 because I figured it took at least 2 years to get my mindset into the idea of selling a practice. And listening to what you guys were saying, a couple of things popped into my mind because I had a large practice. So I think in a large practice, the valuation is more important almost in a small practice, because think about the fact that when you sell a large practice, most people, just like a large house, have to go to a bank to get a loan. Unless you have an excellent valuation to present to the bank for the person buying your practice, they're not going to be able to get a loan or obtain a loan to buy your practice. So the first thing is, like both of you guys said, I can't agree more. Think about when you want to sell your practice. Think about the fact that your accountant has been paid to keep the IRS from getting a lot of your money. So you're not showing a lot of your income. Like Mike said, it's being, you know, filtered in many different ways. And then they come in and they do they do evaluation, and there's a lot more money that you're actually producing than you even realize. So you really need that third-party evaluation. But I would say at least 2 to 3 years to answer your question, Mike.
Okay, thank you. You know, and one other thing that I'll just veer off the path a little bit with, though, is that a practice may value at a range, but value and price are not always equal. Now, most of the time, value is a starting point, but the market drives the price of where things will be and how the transactions will work. But things that we talk about, value drivers, the location, the market, your infrastructure, your referral base and the patient flow, all those things are critical that we have the information to work with so that we can, when we get to the end of the day, we can tell the story of the practice. One of the most important things that I will say about your evaluation of your practice is it tells a bit about the story of your practice, how long you've been in practice, what kind of patients you see, what are the statistics that go with it, you know, key metrics, revenue per new patient, revenue per visit, those kind of things, how many new visits to total visits, all those come into play as to what are key value drivers in the process. John was just talking about the regulatory documents, but the last 2 points there are probably some of the biggest things that I think are absolutely driving people crazy right now. Trying to either find the lease agreement or get to lease agreements is one thing. Well, I started this lease agreement 15 years ago, and me and the landlord, we know each other, so we let it roll, and it rolls, and suddenly you get ready to sell, and they want to see a copy of the lease, and the last time it was renewed was 7 years ago, and you're not sure who has a copy of it. I've seen it derail things for 60 days to get back on track. And then the great discussion about payer contracts. Who's keeping up with those payer contracts that you have right now? In recent months, I've been in contact with some people who have some pretty unique arrangements with payers because of their market location and the services they provide. The question is would that contract transfer? And being able to quote unquote find it, put your hands on it, and make sure you can transfer it, because that's a revenue stream that's really important to you and your practice.
Yeah, Mike, I'll say the payer contracts are one of the things that I want to see up front, whether I'm representing the buyer or the seller, before we even finalize what the structure of a transaction is going to be. And I'll give you the perfect example, right? If I have a practice that's being sold and they have group contracts, right? Not individual contracts, but group contracts that are assigned to the actual entity, professional corporation, PLLC, whatever the case may be. Then some consideration may be given to selling the practice in an equity deal as opposed to an asset deal. And, you know, most buyers, and again, I know this could be an entirely, separate webinar or presentation on, various deal forms. But the long and short of it is an equity deal is when you buy the actual entity, and an asset deal is when you don't buy the entity, you just buy the assets, right? Or certain assets that you want access to. But something like a payer contract being assignable, particularly if it's a closed panel and it's not like you can just enroll in that particular payer's network as a new practice, that's going to drive deal structure, right? So this is going to be one of the first things that you're going to be asked to provide as a selling practice. But really, and it's more than just payer contracts. It's your lease agreements, and it's not just space. It's how about equipment leases? I can't tell you how many times we've had a deal held up because there are residual payments being made on equipment, whether it's a lease or a financial statement, and there are UCC liens that have been filed, and nobody can find the agreement to figure out what process needs to be followed to either assign the equipment or to pay it off at closing so that the lien can be cleared, right? So much in the same way that, whether it's Dropbox or Box or, even iCloud, You should have some electronic repository of all your financial records. You need to have an electronic repository of all of your legal documents as well. And frankly, you should be doing that whether or not you're preparing to sell your practice, because these are essential documents that govern the day-to-day business operations. But yes, payer contracts, 1000% is something that needs to be looked at upfront to make decisions on the best way to structure.
Okay. Then the next part I talk about is how are you going to talk about your practice? What are the, so I get asked a lot, you know, how do we tell people about our practice, or how do I tell people about my practice? Well, one of the things I recommended doing now is having people make pictures in their office of the office equipment. Have to understand that time, date, stamps proof that you actually have the equipment sitting in your office as of that time. And it's the easiest way to say, this is my equipment, this is what it looks like, these are what these are the chairs, the x-ray unit, ultrasound, whatever else you have, lasers, they're all here, they're all in good condition. You can look at them and see. In this day and age, the way we use technology, it's a really easy way to prove up what you have. Also about your location, being able to be descriptive with the location is important. Remember, most everybody can go out and use Google Earth and put in an address and look at the exterior pretty quickly and get a pretty good idea of the lay of the land. So what services are you offering? What is your referral pattern? What's that mix? And what's the payer mix that goes with those patients? And then we talk about, you know, who is the market, who in your market is being a consolidator, or are there people there that are looking to buy, and being able to know who that is, as well as the national companies that are out there. The private equity guys are all over the market. They're continuing to have new capital infusions. You've seen the consolidation of 2 of them. There'll be more on the list. There's a lot of activity that way, but there are also people that are taking their own initiatives to grow from a local standpoint and build into local regional practices, not necessarily utilizing private equity money, but that's some of the things that are going on there. We're seeing a lot more doctor to doctor deals than we have historic in the past couple of years. One of the biggest things impacting everything right now is the cost of money. And so with that jump, it has changed some of the dynamic that way when it comes to structuring, but it's also something to consider and keep in mind that way.
Yeah, Mike, on the doctor to doctor transactions, I mean, you know, I know one of them that I had recently was with you, and I've had 2 probably in the last year where we were deep in, I wouldn't even say negotiations. We were deep in diligence towards looking to complete transactions where clients of mine were going to sell to, you know, PE-backed large practices, and both of them fell through. And in both instances, those practices were pretty, I mean, the doctors, they hadn't so much as just checked out, but they were ready to exit, right? And in both circumstances, we were able to identify another practice, not PE backed, but local in the marketplace that was looking to expand, and they stepped in, and ultimately those transactions closed. So it's not just the large practices that are gobbling up. There are a lot of physician to physician transactions going on. And even with the increase in interest rates, I'm still seeing more and more transactions come in the door each and every day. For whatever reason, maybe it's an aging physician population. Maybe it's that some of these younger doctors are more entrepreneurial than we gave them credit over the last 5 or 10 years. But there has been a market increase in physician to physician transactions, in my view, over the last 2 or 3 years.
It's begun to, it went through a lull for a little bit. And of course, 20 sort of made some of that dynamic go sideways. But towards the 18, 19, it had slowed a little bit, but now it's picked back when there's quite a bit of that going on. When when somebody's going to do due diligence, make it easy. So put everything in a place where you can get to it and have it for somebody. The report that you've had for the practice valuation, any market information that you have that is not common or that somebody else doesn't know, how many other DPMs are within a reasonable range of your practice. I don't consider that a threat. I don't consider the other podiatrists in the market a threat, because generally you build on each other. The marketing material that you have, that you're using, one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now is people want to be sure they get websites, they get social media accounts, and anything like that that's tagged to the practice would be important for them to be able to see how it's been used and utilized so that they can take it and continue to grow with it.
So part of that diligence file is all your login credentials, right? If you're using LinkedIn or Facebook or, you know, whatever these social media accounts, same with your website. For example, if you're hosting in a, you know, an environment like, God, it slipped my mind, but the most common website platform that allows you to log in on the back end of it. So, but in terms of keeping it organized, one of the things that I would suggest is, you know, even break it down into subfolders, right? Imagine this is an actual file cabinet and you have separate folders for each type of document, right? So, you know, if you're just storing in like a Windows-based folder system, you've got your legal documents, you've got your financial documents, you have your personnel documents, right? If you have physician staff or if you have employees, guess what? I mean, you're going to have copies of your employment tax filings, an employee handbook if you have one, plan documents for any employee benefit plans like health or 401k or any of these things. But in terms of putting it all together, make it easy. If you turn this over to a buyer and they have to spend 2 days just trying to organize it, you are conveying precisely the wrong message as to whether or not you are a good practice to purchase, right? So make it easy for them, right? Folders upon subfolders, etc. You know, get your full OCD on and make this really easy for whoever's looking at it, whether it's the buyer themselves, buyer's attorneys, buyer's accountants, whatever.
One thing I want to point out, I talk about key factors affecting practice operation. Your infrastructure will make a huge difference in how somebody views your practice and their ability to acquire it and to run forward with it. So here's a couple of live illustrations. If you have family members that are running the practice and they are doing a great job doing it, but you as the doctor getting ready to retire, they're not going to stay. So the buyer has to replace your office manager, who could very well be your spouse or another family member. And you have to remember, they are absolutely critical to you being able to do your job as a doctor and to make sure things happen. And one of the things that we want to do is make sure that that transition goes just as well as your transition, because it may sound like it's not as big a deal in certain ways, but I can tell you, I've seen some fall completely off the table because suddenly we don't have anybody to run the practice. And if you borrowed money to make the payments, it's not any fun when billing's not handled right, or the accounts payable's not handled right, or employees aren't getting paid properly. All those things create a real challenge, I'll use the word to say, on the post-transaction issues.
And Mike, that's particularly true in this doctor-to-doctor dynamic, right? Listen,
Right.
These larger practices that are coming in, they've got their own operating system. And frankly, post-closing, the transition is going to be more on, you know, the seller's end, if the seller is going to stick around as an employed physician or in some transition period. But when it comes to these physician-to-physician transactions, it's so critical, right, that these operational concerns are first disclosed during diligence, and that there's some mechanism for the continuation of the business post-transaction. Listen, the worst transaction in the world is one where 6 months or a year after the fact, one or both parties is dissatisfied, right? The whole key here is to make it a win-win, right? Selling physician is going to get value. Buying physician is going to get a business that perhaps they can build a wonderful life for them and their family. Awesome. But that doesn't happen if these things aren't discussed and fleshed out during that process.
I know that Bruce, you went through, you had a couple of deals that were offered to you that you didn't take, but then you had the one that you did take, you still had a pretty involved transition that went with it, if I'm not mistaken.
It really was involved. I've been taking notes, and I wanted to ask John to also talk about this, but assignable leases came up as a really major point for me because I had a location in a medical building that was essential for me to stay there and for the new practice to come in. And I didn't know enough about assignable leases. I kind of learned, and I was lucky enough to have that situation where I could get my lease assigned to the new doctor coming in. But that's something, to get back to John's point, that should be researched in advance. The other thing with me is that I had a large practice and I was unable to find a single doctor that was able to take over my practice. And I'm not saying that in any, bragging way. It's just that us old guys learned how to build a practice over a period of years, and it got so big that I was used to it. Some of the younger doctors didn't want to quite work that hard. So I had to find a 2-doctor practice, and that was a little bit harder to find 2 doctors to be interested in. And then what I did is I actually had some vacation time, and I asked them to come into my practice and work for a week or so and learn and see if my patients would get along with them and my staff, and B, whether or not they were comfortable with the practice. I wanted them to actually see how busy we were. And it was quite positive for me. After I got back from vacation, they said, wow, this practice is everything you said it was going to be. Your equipment works great, the x-rays, everything else like that. So I think that's really a good thing to do, as long as you have confidence in yourself that if you expose them to the practice, it's not a big deal. But I would definitely recommend that. That's how I did it. But it does take a couple of years. You have to really be careful. And if you really care about your patients, and I think that's the part that sometimes I can add to it, is that you care about your patients after 30 or 40 years in practice. You want to make sure you're getting doctors that care about them as much as you do. And because you don't want to leave your patients to just anybody. And that was one of my main goals.
Okay.
And that's such a hugely important point, right? Because it's a business, and through all of this, it's almost as though you have to take the treating physician hat off and become a business person. But at the same time, what's the why, right? Why were we here in the first place, and what's the why moving forward? And that's to take care of a patient base. So that focus is critical and sometimes gets lost. On the assignability issue, I mean, this is an interesting point because a lot of times when we're negotiating leases, years before there's been any conversation of the potential for a sale, this is something that we usually like to dig in on, is that we would require a landlord to put something in there to say maybe a lease isn't assignable, because generally they're not, but it would be, in the event of a sale of all or substantially all of the assets of the tenant, right? And that there would have to be some sort of approval process, and that the landlord would ultimately have to, sign off, but not unreasonably withhold their consent to such an assignment, right? And that the buyer would have to take on all the obligations, et cetera. So it can get really complicated. Now, if that's not in your lease, and maybe you didn't think of it 15 years ago when you first negotiated your lease, then I think that you identify really early on that before we get too far down this road, a conversation has to be had with the landlord as to whether or not we're going to be able to pull something off, right? Because even if it's not in the lease, doesn't mean that they can't agree to make an exception, particularly if the buyer is going to, agree to take on the responsibility for the remaining financial obligation, right? I don't think I've ever had it just summarily dismissed. It's just sometimes they require perhaps an additional security deposit, perhaps a financial or personal guarantee of some kind from the purchasing practices, physician owners. But yes, that's another thing, like payer contracts, that we want to explore up front, because it may change how we structure the transaction ultimately. Like, for example, in an equity deal, arguably you wouldn't need an assignment of the lease, because if the tenant is the entity and it's just the ownership of the entity that's changing hands, well, then we don't have to do anything with the lease. So.
And on a contrarian note, which is really interesting, I had some people that were negotiating a acquisition, and the buyer went to the landlord in advance of the LOI being signed. And it caused some heartburn, to say the least, because suddenly they had not notified the landlord that that was going on. So you just never know sometimes when you get into transactions what the next step will be. But the assignment of a lease, it took 150 days for one lease to be assigned that I was working with a few years ago. And the buyer wanted it so bad they stayed with the deal, but I was really surprised because it was just inordinately difficult. Transaction planning, this does not, in my opinion, get discussed very much, but I think it's absolutely critical. Knowing what your walkaway points are on both price, terms, financing. If you don't know, you know where you're starting, but if you don't know what you're willing to end at, if you don't know that going in, then you'll end up negotiating against yourself. And there's always points that you have to contend with. But if you don't set sort of, this is my floor of where I'm willing to go to, these are the terms I'm willing to take, what's involved, is transition involved or not? And if I have to do financing, what are the security pieces that go with it? But knowing what your compromise points are and where you're going to be with them. If somebody, here is my base theory. If somebody's asking a seller to finance, then you get one of the options comes off the table. Price comes off the table because you can't discuss financing and a buyer taking all risk and playing with the price. It just, in my equation, it doesn't work. So if you got all it, and then you go by the golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules. So you come in with all cash, then you got room to negotiate, but you have to know what you're willing to accept and on those terms, and whether or not there's any transition work after the deal's completed, or is SBA involved and they want a 20% carry back by the seller, or some arrangement of that nature. But I can't be strong enough in saying what's your point of walk away when the moment you start, because if you don't know it, you'll end up in a spiral and not know where to stop. And I think that's just a fundamental point to me of negotiation, that there's always some back and forth, there's discussions that go with it, but the one thing you want to do is know what's important to you and have it outlined with you and your team, what you can do. And that's where meeting with your accountant, your planner, all the people that impact you and how you impact them and everything. Some people say, well, I just want to sell. Well, that's fine. And then you start talking about a deal. Well, that's not a good enough deal, but that's not what was conveyed. So you have to look at that. And if you're in the process of buying a practice, then the question is what's your top point and what's your walkaway point for being willing to purchase? Is it all about price? Is it all about how you pay for it? What are the pieces that go with it? Who's going to stay? Who's going to leave? All those things, but knowing what your compromise points are really, really critical at that time.
And I think also willing to be transparent about it, right?
Right.
So I've had sellers that, their biggest thing was, look, I have to stick around for a little while to help out with the transition, but it's 90 days. That's it. I'm not going any further. This is a retirement play for me. And so you go into the negotiation and they know, hey, I'm willing to be a little flexible on price. I'm willing to be a little flexible on terms, but I'm doing 90 days and then that's it. And it's your problem, right? So I think transparency from the beginning, or authenticity in negotiation, and making clear what's important to you. And to the point about financing, yes. I mean, you can't, I can't tell you how many times I've said to attorneys on the other side of a transaction, well, You can't ask for a deal and then also ask for my client to be your bank. That's just not how it's going to happen.
And the other part is if you're talking about financing, a lot of people will talk about doing pre-tax financing. And let me put it this way, that would be more like, you get 10% of collections or something like that. And I'm using a term that I'm going into a range that I don't like to discuss, because the moment that it is not a bona fide promissory note, you end up with tax consequences for the seller that you don't have as the buyer. Now, if it's structured the right way, everybody can win. But let's remember this, the difference between the general range of difference between capital gains and ordinary income tax is between 15 and 20%. So if you negotiate price and then you say, well, I want to put some of this over into a consulting agreement, and suddenly you start discounting that, well, you just took one in the shorts for doing it that way, because suddenly you're paying as the buyer, as the seller, you're paying all the tax on it, and it's not going to feel good when you get to the end. So look at what cash to cash is.
Yeah, Mike, cash to cash, because there are tax consequences. But again, the minute we start talking about, so in the non-healthcare M&A world, something like earnouts or a percentage of revenue, these things are done all the time. It's really difficult to do it in healthcare. We have anti-kickback considerations that we have to deal with, particularly for a lot of podiatry practices have very substantial Medicare populations. So there's regulatory entanglements here that come into play as well. So again, I think we could do a whole other webinar on that, but I think the key here is don't, you could make it really complicated, and you could really put a lot of downside risk for the seller, both from a tax and a compliance perspective, if you try to get too cute.
Yeah. Here's questions to answer. What's your desired transition plan? How long, how much, days per week, per month? I had one seller, the buyer said, I want you to work for me some, but you're going to have to be gone for 90 days right after we do the transaction, because if you leave, then they'll be coming to me. And when you come back, then they can see you. But I want to be sure that we transition the practice the right way. I mentioned this a while ago, talking about staff and staff retention. Who stays, who goes, referral sources, are there primary care, are there other specialties that are referring to you, and then external revenue sources, nursing homes, which is, those contracts are so driven by the individuals that you have to step back and look at and see what the ability to transfer is and what the risk is that goes with them. And when I say risk is whether you can retain them the way you think you will, and how that builds into your overall negotiating strategy and your transition strategy. I've had some practices that had busy offices and busy nursing homes, and they'd sell one without the other. So there's different ways that you can come in and slice those things so that they work for you. You just have to be able to delineate where the revenue is coming from and how it's going to work. And then set expectations. I think one of the biggest things right now is setting a time frame expectation of what is realistic and when you can sell a practice. Excuse me, I had one that sold, and that was approximately a 6-month window from the time it went on the market till the time it closed. I've had some others. I got one suspended in animation right now that's probably taken 75 days since we did the initial signing of the transaction agreement because of credentialing. Let me put it this way. The thing that plays with your time frame will be credentialing on the buyer side. It is, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm going to tell you, I got people that are in the same market, acquiring a practice 10 miles down the road, and we're up to 120 days on getting that new office credentialed. It's it's been and they're not doing it internally. They're using a service for people that know what they're doing. So it's one of those things to consider. We talked about setting expectations on price and how you realize the value of the transaction. How are you going to put money in the bank from this? And how's it going to be part of your overall plan? It goes back to the first slide. Get your team together, get things organized, get people on board so that as things start to happen, you can put it together that way. This is a way to get in touch with me. I've got John's email address as well. We've got those connected as well as Bruce. But this is, excuse me, this is our presentation, but now we're going to open it up for Q&A, and I'm going to take the sharing screen piece away so that this doesn't stay up there all the time.
All right, so we did get a few questions. Mike, I know you took a couple. Let's see. One question was, what is a planner? When you reference a planner, do you mean a financial planner?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Let's see. What are the upfront fees? Did you already talk about this one? And retaining your firm to represent a DPM in the sale of a practice? And what percentage of the purchase price do you charge?
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll be glad to do that offline, but I generally don't discuss fee structure on a call. On a presentation, I will tell you there's two components that we give you the option of doing. One of them is that you can engage our services to put together the package of evaluating the practice. That's a fixed fee. There's a fee that goes with the closing of the transaction.
All right, I am sending your email address to him. What percentages of your podiatry practices sell versus just closing down?
Probably between 90 and 95% of everybody that we're working with is closing. We do have a couple that haven't. A couple of different issues that surface around that, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, there's 110% of people that engage us to work with them that we're closing. Part of it is just strictly market driven as to, well, I didn't want to share my calendar. Can you do me a favor? Can you get it where for some reason I'm not getting, I need to
Yes, I can do that.
unshare my screen.
Let's see here.
Apologize for that.
All right, well, while we're working on that, stop participant sharing. There we go. Okay.
There we go.
So another question came in. This one was emailed to me. I am considering bringing in an associate and contract with him to purchase the practice 6 months until he is participating with all the insurances at my address. Is he or she able to see patients and bill for services rendered under my name?
I'll take this one, and the short answer is no. And it's a huge issue with Medicare. For example, they routinely request money back when services are billed in the name of one physician when another physician is the actual provider of services. I have seen some folks talk about, incident 2 requirements, but for the most part, the answer is no. And so when you're bringing on an associate or you're selling your practice, this is something that Mike addressed. Building in adequate time to take care of the credentialing is something that has to be part of the transition process.
All right. Are there specialized realtors for this type of transaction?
Bruce, you want to answer that?
I am a realtor in Arizona, so I can give you some feedback on that. What we do is Mike and I break down the component. We kind of work together on this. We figure out about the practice itself. Okay, what is the practice itself? What is its worth, etc. And then we attack the building. What the building do they have? How long has it been in operation? And I belong to a big firm, Remax, which is all across the country. So I have realtors in every state that I can address and ask questions about the building, find out how much it's worth, et cetera. So we can handle that as ourselves. There's nothing wrong with getting an outside realtor. And I want to stress what John said a zillion times. We are not attorneys or accountants. We need you to use your attorney and use your accountant. And we stress that. We try to get the thing started and get you about 95% there. And then we get you guys to get your own people to represent you, to give you all the answers. And one last point, John, on that last one, the last question that the audience asked, the only issue with that one that can work is if you have a person who you want to bring into your practice who has their own Medicare number in that state, is licensed in that state, they can bill under their own Medicare. So they could see your patients and bill under their Medicare number without you getting in trouble. But you would not control those fees. Those fees go directly to the second provider, correct, John?
It is, but they can also assign contractually the right to those payments. So if they have their own Medicare number and it's just a process of having them linked to the group, that's different than that provider not being enrolled with Medicare at all. And that's what I was addressing, right? So what you've addressed is a little bit of a different circumstance where the purchaser or the associate physician is enrolled with Medicare, they're just not associated with that group. They can continue to bill and they'll be paid under their own individual Medicare credentialing, and they can assign that payment over to the group effectively by executing checks. But it's very cumbersome. But again, there's nothing wrong there. There's no need to bill under the selling physician in that context.
And we do a great deal of those type of contracts where we will get an associate who's already experienced and has a Medicare number and also has a state license so that we can get them off the practice off and running. And if they want to get involved in a sale down the road, this is a perfect type of person to bring into their practice because they already have that practice experience. So we do look to pair those if possible.
Yeah, and if I could just, there's one thing that Bruce mentioned, and again, there's no bigger advocate of Mike and Bruce and provider of resources than I. And one of the reasons why is they make my life easy, right? When they bring a deal to me, everything has been worked out. All the things we're talking about today have been addressed, and there's usually a comprehensive term sheet that makes my drafting of the contracts that are going to effectuate that transaction far easier. And there's certainly going to be some things, for example, that come up during the process that we'll have to address. But for the most part, it becomes a really easy, smooth transaction. Whereas when I'm not working with Mike and Bruce, and again, I'm perhaps working with the client directly, I've got to spend a lot of time walking them through those things. And a lot of times it's directing them to their accountant for this answer, to your payroll folks for this answer. So, in terms of the dynamic, because it's a question I get a lot, well, how do you and Mike work for each other? Well, I let Mike figure out the structure of the terms with the client, and then I come in when it's time to paper it and turn it into a legally enforceable agreement.
All right. What role does your firm play in the credentialing process?
We don't do credentialing. I want you to go out. I can refer you to 2 or 3 people just right off the cuff. Be glad to do that, but you need to be engaged with people who do credentialing as a core part of their business. I equate it to doing rear foot and ankle surgery. If you're not proficient in it, I don't recommend doing it. It may sound odd that I don't do my own tax return, but I also have an advisor that I work with that works through it with me. Accountants and attorneys make some of the worst tax and legal people that you want to be around on their own side. But to answer your question, there are 3 or 4 firms that are doing a lot of work in podiatry that we can get you the name and contact information for. More than happy to do that.
All right. What are your thoughts about the private equity backed groups buying practices?
So let me weigh in on that a little bit, because I'm not the anti-private equity person, but I think it needs to be examined for you. Because your buddy does it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. Private equity has a place. I mentioned earlier, two or three of the firms have rattled the sabers, and Balance Health out of California, the West Coast, has merged with Wild Group, Wild Foot and Ankle. You've got Phasma, which is, I don't know, running rampant in Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, sort of that mid-Atlantic region down into North and South of Carolina. I think they've even stepped into Georgia, so they're strong. Upperline has just got $60 million in new financing. Half of it went into equity and half of it went into debt. You've got Pacesetter, which is still out there. You've got a group out of Texas called, it's either Stride Right or Stride Care. They're acquiring, they have some different models that are there. And then you've got the regional players that are there. But private equity has a place. You need to know and understand their culture. You need to figure out, do I fit? And if I do, why do I fit? And if I don't, why don't I fit? What is your end game? Is your end game to come in and go to work because and be accountable for what you've done, or is your job, or is your goal to come in, work, set my own tone, set my own pace? Because if you sell to a private equity firm, things will change. There is no way they're going to pay you money and not change the way you do business, because you wouldn't sell if there wasn't changes that they thought they could make and improve operations and reach their goal. Their target is a 20% return. It's not a secret. It's not unique to healthcare. It's in any of the firms, and their goal is to make an investment and get their return. I think John's seen a couple of the private equity deals.
I think I've done deals with just about every one of the major players. And I think that the answer is it's really an individual inquiry as to, whether it's successful or not. I have some doctors, some clients who've become dear friends that have sold to PE-backed groups, and they are happy as could be. And I've had some others that are, less than satisfied. But a lot of it has to do with understanding, I think, that very key point, Mike, is that the culture of your practice is going to change, right? Yes, many of the same folks and personalities and people will be there, but the way you do things is going to change. And frankly, that's going to happen even if you just sell to another physician, right? I tell clients all the time, if you are sort of like me, and one of the reasons that you are, out on your own, threw your own shingle up, was so that you could be your own boss and you could sort of make your own hours and make your own rules. Selling to anyone is going to be difficult because that calculus is going to change. And it's no different. I think sometimes folks that are selling see big numbers and they get lost in the number, and they're not, honest with themselves about what it's going to be like on the back end of receiving that number. So I think, the PE buyers have been great for podiatry in a lot of respects. First of all, it's proof, case in point, and I've been saying this for probably 10 or 15 years, that you can be financially successful in podiatry, right? There wouldn't be all these really smart finance types investing in podiatry if it wasn't a lucrative industry to be involved in. That's first and foremost. So the proof is in the pudding here, folks, right? But then secondarily, all of these transactions have sort of triggered almost a secondary market of these physician-to-physician transactions, right? Mike had indicated there's a lull for a little bit of time, but now there's a lot of different types of buyers in the marketplace. And a lot of that was triggered by, the hyper speed pace at which some of the PE groups got into the market. So I don't think a PE buyer is any different than any other buyer in that regard, that, you know, it's an individual inquiry. And if you are honest with yourself about what you can, deal with on the back end of a transaction, then you could be happy with a PE sale just as, easily as you could be for any other sale.
All right, I'm back. Sorry, I had a little delay coming back to the team, but I made it. So I'm gonna field some of these questions for you guys too. Do you do the due diligence marketing the practice to generate interested entities?
We do. We use social media, PM News. Bruce has developed some real relationships with some of the schools and residency programs. We tap into that, but yes, we help to develop the marketing and business development for selling the practice.
All right.
Oh, sorry, Ann, go ahead.
You go ahead.
Okay, if there's a moment of silence, I'm going to take it. How often does a hospital system purchase a practice versus an individual doctor?
Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, I've seen a market decrease in hospital-based acquisitions, and a lot of it had to do with a couple of years ago, they made a change in the Medicare fee schedule that in order to get the hospital rates for services, you had to be on campus, right? That was a change. So we thought a lot of physician practices being acquired by hospitals and continuing to operate off campus and being, being able to access that higher fee schedule. Medicare made that change. And so a lot of the hospital acquisition slowed down. Now, it hasn't stopped. And I think every hospital system has a different strategy, right? For example, I'm here in New Jersey where we have a couple of very dominant players in the market, and each one of them handles how they structure their companion medical groups much differently. So that is going to be something that's probably geographic specific, but as a larger point, I've seen less of it over the last few years.
I've seen it drop, and I've even seen some of the hospital employment sort of plateau a bit. Now it may be picking back up. I was talking to somebody this afternoon that is considering entertaining an offer from a hospital, but on a percentage basis, I would say hospitals probably make up less than 3% of the podiatry population. Last time I checked, there were approximately 12,000 podiatrists in private practice. And then there's another probably 1,500 to 2,000 that are in military and other private service sector arrangements. Those numbers are close in the ways. We're also seeing a little bit of a trough in people coming out of residency. We're experiencing some of that as a result of, 10 years ago, people went to college, they decided they did their major, then they said, I'll go to podiatry school, or maybe I'll go into technology. And we had a big push for people going into being able to work from wherever they wanted to. So if you take back 7 years, it's what I've been taught to do, a 3-year residency and 4 years of podiatry school. You walk back 7 years and see what was happening. Well, that was 2016, and everybody was trying to figure out, exactly what social media was going to do and how it was going to work and those kind of things. And it was an alluring thing where you could go and make a decent income and work from the mountains, the beach, the park, wherever you wanted to, as long as you had an internet connection. So it's going to take a little bit for the market to saturate a little bit better with new residents coming out. But, I think number one employments are with private practices, and the distant second, and maybe not so distant second, is the private equity groups, because they have lots of resources they're going after it with, and then you'll get down the road to where you're at the hospital level.
All right. We have a question that was emailed to us. And just as a reminder, if you joined us a little late, we're having some technical issues with our Q&A and our chat. So if you're unable to access that, you can email us your question and we'll answer it live here. I sent all the attendees an email with that information. You can just reply to that email. So this question is there any value in a trade name or website?
I can answer that.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I can answer that. That actually happened with me. So yes, there is value in a trade name. Now with my particular sale, Mike can address, I don't recall what the exact value is, but my trade name went along with all my social media and it was quite successful and we figured in the sale. So yes, there is a value to that. And if I can make one point back with private equity, from a podiatrist standpoint, when you're a podiatrist, you get involved in private equity, the number one complaint that I've had, because people will come and pull me aside, they say that it changes the entire way that you practice. Now, if you're a person who wants to do surgery all day long, they want you to see the maximum amount of patients, create the maximum amount of money in their time frame. They take over your billing and they take over your practice. So from a podiatrist standpoint, you have to be prepared to make a complete change in the way that you practice medicine. So it's not so much the income is good, but you have to weigh that. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
No, you're fine. It's important to have the physician perspective, and that's what counts.
All right, I'm going to throw one more at you. Is bank financing the most common way you have seen to help fund these practice transactions?
I don't know if it's the most common, but I'll say it's the preferred. And what I mean by that is if I'm representing a seller, I'll express to them that you might even want to be flexible on the purchase price in lieu of being a bank. When you hold the note or hold the paper, you take on all the risk. Now you can go ahead and charge interest. I saw there's a question coming up about charging interest if you're holding a note, and certainly that's appropriate. A bank wouldn't give you an interest-free loan, so why should you? The only circumstance where perhaps it might be something that is, preferred to having the buyer go out and secure third-party financing is if, for example, the selling physician isn't looking for a lump sum, but is looking for something more residual. Maybe the retirement planning is such that the tax advantages of being paid out over time outweigh the tax advantages of being paid a lump sum up front. But if you're going to hold a note, we've got to worry about, putting a security interest in place in the accounts receivable. We have to put all sorts of things that the same way a bank would to make sure that principal amount in interest is collateralized to a certain degree. So my perspective would be, again, when representing a seller, is I would want the buyer to have third-party financing more often than not.
There is no substitute for an all cash deal. There's just not. Even if you take a little bit of a bite on the price, you're reducing your risk. And that's the reason I said a while ago that if you get into owner financing, then price to me comes off the table, and it's all about terms and conditions as you go through the deal.
All right. Can you assist a seller in finding a private equity deal? I'm assuming that's what PE stands for.
Yes, it
Okay.
is.
Can you assist in finding a private equity deal and have the doc still work for another 10 years? That's part A. And then part B, do you believe a portion as cash and some stock is the common deal structure?
Yes, and yes, and I'll expand. Yes, we have relationships with the private equity people. We're talking to them probably every other week, or maybe not quite that often, but quite frequently. And one of them's located here in town where I'm at, so it's not a big deal. Yes, you can find them, you can talk to them. A lot of them have this. A majority of them have the split deal where it's cash and stock, with the upside being the stock that has a maturity value after 3 to 5 years. There's certain parameters for how you're able to cash that out, what it looks like, and that's where the deal sweetener gets to be. Employment agreements, they have them. they actually like that. That's their preferred deal. Their preferred deal is to have somebody sell to them, agree to work with them, take a split of cash and stock, and ride off into the sunset for a long extended period together. So, I mean, and these guys are out there. They have the deals, they have the deal structure, and they got people that are ready, willing, and able to talk.
The only caveat I'd throw in is that I can't imagine a scenario where a PE-backed group is going to give you an employment contract where they don't have the right to terminate your employment without cause. Certainly within 10 years. The longest I think we've been able to negotiate without cause termination is 3. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't be possible. And of course, you always can be terminated for cause. I mean, understand that dynamic. You may own some equity in a holding company or an MSO, but you're an employee and employees can be terminated. And there's never going to be an employment contract that doesn't contemplate a circumstance where you might be fired.
All right, so I have 2. One is, Mike, can you share with us, and you can send it to Sarah and I, and we'll forward it, your list of credentialing companies that you recommend?
Be glad to.
Okay, super. And then the other is, if you have an associate for many years and you want to sell to that associate, how do you know when it's time to transition? How many years before you want to phase out?
I guess I'm going to answer that this sort of the way John started the whole conversation tonight was, it's never too early to start that. They can buy in and buy you out over time. That can be a 1 year, a 3 year, a 5 year, a 7 year period. So there's a couple of things that that everybody needs to understand, though. Are they prepared to run a business? And what are you doing to help them prepare to run that business? Because just because they're a long-term associate doesn't necessarily mean that they understand what goes into making sure everything happens. If you're a long-term associate and you're used to making and getting paid well, then the question also becomes, why do I want to buy it and take on the responsibility of being an owner? Being an owner and being self-employed is not for the faint of heart, but it has great rewards that go with it. And the flexibility that goes with it is as important as anything. I've seen people buy practices. They work really hard for the first 5 to 8 years. They get their practice paid off. They get things organized, it's set up, and then they start letting the practice work for them. They make a good living. They take the time off. They do the things they want to do. Not that they're not taking time off in the early years, but they're not taking it in the same way that they do once they get 10 to 12 years out and they have an established practice and they have their structure in place.
I'd actually, the only thing I'd add is, this is my preferred means of divesting from a practice, right? I think you are going to maximize your value if you sell to someone who's there and knows it and wants it. And getting back to Dr. Levin's point from earlier, that's the best way to make sure that your patients are going to be taken care of, right? In the best means possible. And in a perfect world, if it's one doctor buying out another, we would structure it in phases over 10 years. Start with buying 10%, right? The next jump is to 25. Then maybe we get to 50-50 somewhere around the 5-year period. And again, this makes it bite-sized pieces for the buyer, so it's not financially prohibitive, but it also gives the seller various points where if it's not working out, particularly after the first couple of installments, they're still the super majority owner and can pivot to another strategy if need be. So I'm an enormous proponent of this, and I just think it's something that you can't do all at once. Try to do it over time. And the most successful transitions that I've been a part of have been over the course of 5 or 10 years between associate to owner.
And if I can answer that as well, everything that you guys said is correct. From a physician's point of view, if you have an associate that you feel has the ability, as Mike said, to take over the practice. There's never too early to discuss, hey, listen, I'm thinking about transitioning over 5 or 10 years. What do you think about taking over my practice? And if the answer is positive, you can start negotiations and discussions with the attorneys. And if it's negative, you should find that out also, because if this person is not going to be the one who's going to take over your practice, perhaps he's an employee that does great with the patients, start looking for another associate that you may want to bring in to buy your practice. And Mike and I just we're dealing with a practice right now where I spoke to the owner's, the podiatrist's wife who runs the practice. And she said, this guy's the best employed podiatrist in the whole world. He couldn't run an office if it hit him with a train. She was so honest with me, I couldn't believe it. And he doesn't want to, but he wants to stay on. So this creates, and John can address this from a legal standpoint also, this creates a good scenario when you're trying to sell your practice, because you say, listen, I have an employed podiatrist that wants to stay for 10 years, that's a great employee, and never wants to buy your practice. So it's a non-competitive podiatrist that makes money for you. It's a win-win for us. So it helps us sell that practice.
And that's cash flow that could be transitioned to the new buyer, right? Like
Exactly.
a high-performing employee is a huge asset of a service-based business.
Mhm.
All right. What are typical formulas for sale of a practice? Net, gross, and I don't know what these letters stand for, but I hope you do. EBITDA.
Mm. The most dreaded word on the face of the planet, called EBITDA. Earnings before interest, depreciation, and taxes, and amortization, and anything else you want to throw in there that's
Dang, that's
non-cash.
a lot.
Okay, so if you look at EBITDA, they're looking at 3.5 to 5.5 on a range. Don't ever forget though, you got to get to what the EBITDA is and understand what it is. If you're looking at net, gross, and things like that, generally, you can look at 35 to 55% of an average of 3 years collections. That average could be a range. It's all driven by what the cash flow of the business is. I'll go back and say it again. Cash flow drives the value. The value drivers also are driven by market, volume, structure, things of that nature. But if you don't know how you are derived and arrived at the infamous EBITDA number, you can do a multiple of 5 on 10 and it's 50. You can do a multiple of 3 on 20 and it's 60. So don't get too carried away about what the multiple is as much as what the actual value is. Because I have people call and say, well, I heard somebody got a multiple of 5, but I hate to say it, but if you don't know what that multiple of 5 is if it's on 5, that's 25. If it's on 50, that's 250. So it's all relative to what's there. It's hard to put. You can give ranges, but I have yet to see 2 practices that are alike. And the uniqueness of them, years ago, I was working with 2 guys that were practicing in the same market in Texas, and they wanted to merge. And so I went and reviewed one practice, and I reviewed them both within a week while I was in their market. And the reason we didn't go forward with a merger was not because they didn't have that there wasn't sufficient volume. It was that their operating environment was so different. It would have blown apart about 6 to 8 months after they had started the process, because they were just too different. One was, we'll walk in today, we'll see these patients. If we decide we're going to change our protocol, we'll change it. The other one was like, you clock in, you go by the numbers, here's the protocol we're going to follow. And so, was one more valuable than the other? On a cash basis, they were relatively close, but from an operating perspective, they were very different.
All right. Is it unreasonable to ask for interest on the payout over a period of time?
You have to, or the service will discount the payments to account for an imputed interest rates. So you have to ask for an interest rate of some kind. And I would say in this market, it's a nominal interest rate today is more like 3%, where it used to be 1 to 2. But now, because interest rates and we're in a rising interest rate environment, you'd have to go to at least 3 to get a nominal rate that the service would probably sign off on. So let me clarify something though. I'm not telling you that a 3% interest rate is what somebody should look for on a loan. I'm saying if there was a seller financing and they simply said, we're going to charge some interest, but not much, then that's about as low as you can go without probably drawing attention.
Do any buyers pay a bonus separate from the selling price?
Trying to think what that would look like. It might be in some kind of consulting arrangement, but it's still going to be part of consideration. John, can you think of what that might look like?
Yeah, that's usually the most common, where again, it's not formally in the transactional documents as part of the purchase price, but there may be some sort of consulting or transition services agreement. This comes up when the seller is retiring and doesn't want to practice any longer, but perhaps they're needed to sort of shake hands and kiss babies to make sure that the patients all are happy and stay, or maybe there's some operational guidance that's needed. So I have seen that. But to my earlier point about when we start trying to, quantify whether it's an earnout or some sort of per patient or percentage based compensation on the back end of the transaction, we've got significant tax and compliance issues that are not for the faint of heart. So it's not something that I've never seen, but to the extent that we can keep it simple, that's usually what I recommend.
What is the usual charge to have an advisor and lawyer help in the sale of a podiatric practice? Is it a set fee or dependent on the sale of the amount of the practice?
I see them range all over the board. There are fixed fees, there are hourly rates, there are transaction consulting fees that go with it. So it's hard to give a range, but I will tell you in a total range perspective, it's hard to put it together because I've seen them. I see them go all across the board. So it's hard for me to say it's 15,000, 20,000, whatever. But your use of your advisors will pay you bigger dividends than the fee that you'll pay if you work with them the right way. If it's only about the fee, then you need to go to Joe's business service down the street and figure it out.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, and I can't speak to consultants or anyone else's other than legal fees, it is impossible to give an estimate without knowing the specifics of the deal. And I'm not even talking the size of the deal. I'm talking about what's going to be involved, because no two deals are the same. But there's a really wide range. I mean, I don't run away from the money conversation, but I can think of just the last year, anywhere between $5,000 and $50,000 is what the legal fees could be for a transaction. And again, that's just podiatry practices. We start getting into M&A with other licensed providers, those numbers grow. And again, sometimes it can be simple, sometimes it's complicated. And so my perspective has always been have a transparent conversation about those fees and expectations up front. And then, that'll allow a client to make an informed choice as to whether or not you're a good fit for them.
Anne, do you want me to do another one or do you have one?
I have one that I'm going to take out of our Q&A because my email has quieted down. Are you seeing a continued trend of younger podiatrists expressing a desire to purchase or run a practice? And will the demand hold up 10 to 15 years from now?
I will say anecdotally, yes. And I mentioned it earlier that perhaps, we weren't giving the younger generation enough credit. But perhaps as they've matured, and I'm talking specifically probably the millennials, as they've hit their late 30s and their early 40s and their priorities are changing a little bit, we are seeing a little bit more of an entrepreneurial spirit. And the younger generation behind them, again, it's for a different reason. A lot of us, and I don't want to age myself here, but I work for myself because I wanted to see directly the fruits of my labor. I think we're seeing a different type of entrepreneurial spirit from this younger generation, and it's about quality of life. They want to have their own practice because they want to set their own rules and they want to set their own priorities. And as an employee, you're not often able to do that. So it's less of a they almost are willing to give up a little financial reward in exchange for that freedom, right? Different priorities. But yes, I am, again, anecdotally, I don't have any sort of numbers to back it up, but just in my practice, I'm seeing more and more younger buyers expressing an interest in running a practice.
Well, I can answer that in a different way. I'm sorry. So just a little bit about what she asked about he asked about the next 10 years. So from a podiatry standpoint, we have the largest number of podiatrists ever that have practiced between 30 and 40 years. These podiatrists are all in the range of wanting to sell, retire, transition, etc. I speak every year in Hawaii to the International Foot and Ankle Foundation, and I can tell you I'll have 20 to 25 people come up to me after I speak wanting to sell their practices. So young people should not be worried about practice being available. The question is, do they want to get into a practice that has a mixture of both regular care, good foot care, ulcer care, wound care mixed with surgery? And that's been my biggest issue, is trying to pair those type of practices with young podiatrists who just want to do surgery. So I think they're going to have to make that transition if they want to buy a practice, to be more aware of the fact that the practices have a multitude of skills that are needed to convert them into successful practices for them.
All right. Sarah, do you have one?
Sure. I
lost track of whose turn it was.
I was struggling to unmute myself because my dogs were like doing WWE wrestling in the background. Does anybody have strong recommendations or suggestions around a post-merger integration to make it smooth and clean? What are your top 3 points during the integration?
I'll take a shot at this. So I think if I'm going to pick 3 things to prioritize in terms of transition planning, I think first would be a communication cascade. And there's 3 components to that, right? There has to be some talking points and a strategy for communicating what's happening to the staff, to the patients, and to the community at large, right? So that communication cascade is critical, and you can't think of it the day after closing. This is something that has to be, thought out and vetted and really a part of the transaction, because there needs to be an agreement and there needs to be cooperation between the buyer and seller on that communication cascade. And then the second piece, I think, would be the administrative transition. And really, a lot of it has to do with how much of the administrative staff, and I'm talking about leadership, I'm not talking about just front office, back office, I'm talking about practice administrator, office manager, chief operating officer, whatever you want to call it. Who's going to be wearing that hat, or who's wearing it now and who's going to be wearing it post-transaction? Mike alluded to this earlier. I mean, we have a lot of practices where, the doctor's wife or husband is also sort of the main administrator of the practice. And usually that spouse is going to be retiring along with the doctor. So there has to be some transition plan there, right? And then finally, I think it's a clinical transaction or a clinical transition. And the most important feature there is the selling doctor going to continue to stick around as a treating provider? And are they going to stick around at the same sort of time and day commitment, or are they going to scale down? And if they're going to scale down, you're likely going to need to bring in another physician. So the recruitment of an additional clinician needs to be part of it, right? So communication cascade, continuity of administrative operations, and continuity of clinical operations, to me, are the three most practical pieces of a transition plan that needs to be addressed.
And on that point, I think you made several excellent points. But I think what the podiatrist who's selling the practice has to know, at least what I try to do, you want to make the practice as attractive to the buyer as possible and the transition to be as easy as possible. I told them I would stay around 2 to 3 months because my thought was any patient that's been coming to me for many, many years will come in pretty much during the time of a 2 to 3 month period. This way, every patient would see me and I can explain the transition. Because you want to leave your practice with doctors that are going to be successful, take care of your patients. I can't say that enough. I mean, unless you didn't like your patients. And also because, you know, you want your good name to continue. You have to, you know, be allowed to retire or transition, but take care of the patient at the same time.
Let me start with a couple of things. John, you talking about a communication cascade. One of the most important things you can do as a buyer and a seller is to make sure your staff is lined up and your critical team members knowing what's going to happen. Making sure that as you ramp towards the transaction, you start with those meetings and you put things in place, because a surprised employee as to a change in benefits and things of that nature is probably going to be one that doesn't stay an employee. They're probably going to go, I don't know what's next, so I'm going to be like a tree and leave. And so as they do that, that communication piece is real important. And then so if you're dealing where it's more than one doctor that's in the seller side and there's associates who are key, making sure that they understand how things are going to transition on a clinical basis is really important. And then you have the things that go with, we're going to get a new AHR, and how's the training going to work, and what's the billing going to look like, and the reporting, all those pieces. It has to be spelled out really clearly as you go in, because if you don't, the next thing that's going to happen is day 3 transition is going to be absolute chaos as you get there. And, you know, you're going to walk in and Betty, Sarah, Joe, and John are all going to be standing there looking like they just fried themselves. And it's because nobody knows who's on first, what's on second, and I really don't know who's on third. So as we look at this, think about that transition strategy, because if you talk to anybody that's been in the private equity space that is there today, they went through a lot of heavy duty acquisitions early on. And then everybody was going, oh my gosh, what do we do with what we got? Not that they didn't know, but how did that transition work and how have they worked to improve that process? Many years ago, I worked for a hospital company and they were on an acquisition tear. And so part of my role was to be the post-acquisition auditor going in. And if you want to see chaos, buy an organization that they don't know what's going to happen next, and you walk in to ask for stuff so that you can look at it and verify information and that kind of thing, and you will see a look of total shock and awe that comes with it. So don't forget, EHR change, maybe the payroll system will change, the billing system, maybe even the phone system, and that sounds real remedial, but you got to be able to answer the phone to be able to take care of patients. So all those things have to be planned out, amped up, looked at going forward so that you know. So.
All right. I am in a practice with 3 equal partners. Do you recommend trying to sell out to your other 2 partners or another new practitioner just coming out of residency?
I'd say look at presumably your partnership agreement or your operating agreement or whatever agreement you have with your partners, because it may very well require you to sell to them, or at least give them a right of first refusal. So, and I also think, just in comparing who's going to have the financial wherewithal to either write you a check or get a loan, I'm going to assume that your two partners that are existing practitioners in your business are going to have much easier access to capital than a new associate coming off of, even coming off of fellowship or residency. So, again, I mean, any buyer could be a good buyer if they're going to meet your terms and you feel reasonably confident about it. But in this scenario, I'd have to think that you're either going to want to skew towards your partners or maybe be legally obligated to offer it to them first, depending upon what your partnership agreement states.
I'm double muted. Are there more practices for sale or doctors looking to buy?
Right now, I think it's a buyer's market. I don't see it. I don't see that it's a seller's market where there's, and a lot of that goes with location. There are certain locations where you, quote unquote, can't get enough practices to list in that market because honestly, there's people chomping at the bit to get there. But as a general rule, there are more practices, people looking to sell than there are buyers in the market right now.
Do private equity firms purchase practices of retiring doctors?
Yes, that's one of their ideal settings, is doctor looking to retire, and they can either merge in with another doctor within a geographic market, because they go off of what the term is used as footprints. So they'll have a footprint within a market, and the theory used to be spoken hub, but it's now just about footprint and market density for a number of practices and providers. But as far as a doctor that's within 2 years of retirement, that's one of the places that they look. They have a deep interest in that. I'll put it that way.
If I sell and I stay, does my compensation impact my, EBITDA?
EBITDA doesn't matter after the sale. EBITDA only matters before the sale. Your compensation will change because there's not but one or two places where cash flow comes from to be used to make the payment on the debt, and one of it is the current owner's compensation line. So if you're used to making 50%, you're not going to make 50% post-transaction, because part of that money is what they just paid you for in advance of. It's more or less a way to look at it as an advance of a couple of years, and they're all different, but 3 to 5 years of your comp. So there's going to be a reduction that goes with that.
How long has it been taking to sell a practice?
I think I mentioned earlier, but 6 months was as quick as we've sold one in the past, but generally 12 to 18 months. And I've got one right now that's gotten up to 21 months because of credentialing. We're at 4 months on credentialing. We had a deal at the table with a contract and it fell off. The buyer lost his deposit and walked away. And then when it came back, we found another buyer for it. And since the time we listed practice, been about 21 months. And I think that goes back to what Bruce was talking about. Bruce said, look, I looked at a 2-year window. And I think that's pretty close to what he was talking about there.
All right. What type of multiples of EBITDA are you seeing in doctor to doctor versus private equity deals?
I've seen them be a little bit richer. One, maybe point and a half. And and I'm going to caveat that with, it depends on where you get to EBITDA with. I mean, if you say your EBITDA is 100,000 and you put a 3 on it, then okay, that's good. If you say your EBITDA is 90,000 and you put a 5 on it, that's 450. So I can give you ranges, but you have to understand all those ranges based off of what that EBITDA number gets to be and how it's computed. What's included as quote unquote add backs, what are one-time and unusual items that affect cash flow that get added back to the cash flow. In other words, so you take a firm like John's, and let's pretend there's 3 partners and it's his doctor's firm. So he drives his Lambo and one of his other partners drives a Ferrari and the other one's driving an Aston Martin. And those are discretionary expenses that they're running through the practice. So they get ready to sell and they go, well, wait a minute, we're putting this in the practice. We're going to add it back to what would be personal income. And so, John has his wife working as a paralegal and doesn't pay her, then we got to add it back as an expense. So, I mean, there's all these nuances of pieces that come into understanding what makes up the earnings before depreciation, interest, and taxes and amortization. And I can honestly tell you that 7 to 8 years ago, that was not a term that was discussed within this profession. If it was, I don't remember it. EBITDA is the new term that hit about 2017, 2018.
All right. I have 2 practices in 2 states. I'm looking to sell one location where I own the building and sole ownership with the practice name trademarked. Any thoughts?
You've got a whole franchise to sell. There's ways to look at, when you get into selling the building with the practice, one of the things to consider is how does the real estate tax valuation impact the overall taxes that you have to pay for both as the seller and as the buyer. We worked on one transaction together where we had them negotiated sort of separately, and then we combined them so that we could reallocate purchase price between the practice and the building so that it didn't negatively affect long-term the buyer. And we were able to help the tax-wise on the seller side. So there's some balance that goes with it. But, it's something you consider. You've got the brand, the real estate, and the practice all together. And it makes for a quote unquote bundled piece to look at that way.
And the intellectual property piece and the branding, and we were talking about, whether it's a bonus or some sort of residual payout. I mean, if you're selling, one practice location with the building and then licensing the trade name to the buyer that you're still doing business under at the other location, that's a license that's going to continue in perpetuity, presumably, as long as they want to continue to do business under that name. So that's an example of how there could be some residual income that continues as part of a transaction, or at least that's how I would approach it, when putting deal terms together.
And the other thing is that we had one, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you. The other thing is that we had one practice where they sold the practice and they kept the building and rented to the podiatrist that bought the practice, and that was quite lucrative for him as well. So it's not necessary to sell the building if he wants to keep it and rent it out.
Correct. Yep.
All right, this is a long-winded one, so bear with me. On the topic of younger buyers, do you find that with the changing landscape of social media and third-party payers, as opposed to the old model of transferring patient goodwill, do you find that those younger buyers are bypassing the practice broker sales model and financing an older practitioner's retirement towards simply credentialing with insurance panels, finding a practice location, doing their own self-marketing, and building successful practices? So I guess, are they kind of letting go of the old way and focusing on the new way and using social media and kind of, I would say it as for sale by owner?
I think I push back that it's an old way, new way, right? This has always been the dynamic. Do I go buy a practice or do I just hang up my shingle and try to build one myself? And I think what the question gets to is whether or not the younger generation thinks that that natural organic buildup may be easier now because of social media and because of other ways to directly interact with your patient base or potential patient base. As opposed to 30 years ago, where it was more sort of boots on the ground, sort of traditional marketing. And there's certainly a component of that, right? But I think this gets back to a point that Dr. Levin made, that when you are looking to sell your practice, you have to make it attractive. You have to make the case that this is transferable cash flow that you're going to be able to take ownership of far quicker than you could ever build organically, right? You could be flipping a switch and have 5 years worth of your marketing work come to fruition. And so, yes, I think there's a piece of it out there, although call me skeptical that a truly attractive practice is going to be left without a buyer because folks think they're going to get podiatry patients off of TikTok. Not just yet. We're not there yet. Close, but we're not there yet.
There's always a place for the self-starter to go about it and do things. I think you have to look at it from two things. How long will it take you to pay back yourself for buying a practice? And how much do you have to invest on the ramp up of starting a new one? Starting a new one takes capital, it takes time. There's a certain amount. One of the things we have to come to agreement on is generally 35 to 40 and 45% of the patients in a podiatry practice are Medicare patients. Now that puts a lot of people into the bracket that are social media savvy because they're above 65, they're Medicare recipients. That population is growing, but whether or not they look there to find their next healthcare provider is another question. When you buy a practice, you've got a built-in patient base. You account for the attrition that goes with it, but you have a built-in patient base that will generate patients and volume and revenue for you on day one when you're going. And I think it depends on what your ability to make the investment is and what that return is and how you can navigate that window of time. And, if you've got enough cash to survive for a few years, then I think you can do it. I mean, I'm not naive enough to say, no, you need to, come to Uncle Mike and talk to him all the time about stuff. You can do that. I'm not naive there, but the other side of it is it depends on how soon you need to turn cash to make it all work the way you want it to.
And I think the other piece is that when you're evaluating your practice, past the numbers, nothing against Mike or John, you have to look at the practice. What I try to do is look at the practice from a podiatrist point of view. How many of these patients have been coming to this practice for so many years that they're going to be loyal patients, and how many of them in your own mind can be transferable? And I think there's still a lot of goodwill out there that people may not goodwill. I found that goodwill worked when I bought a practice years ago and transitioned it into my practice. A lot of the patients stayed, and it's silly to turn that income down. You can still build up on social media. So I think the perfect combination is the combination of both. You purchase a practice for a reasonable amount of money and do your own thing with social media. Certainly the younger doctors are better at that than I was. But I had a pretty good retention rate, maybe 70-75% of the patients stayed with me. Hey, there's nothing like getting a paycheck day one. You don't realize how hard it is to build a practice. I've done that myself. It's really difficult. You got to pay bills right away. It's nice to have that practice that you purchased to help you pay those bills the first few days or first few months.
All right, we have another one that came in via email. So when do you start training the associate's wife on what my wife does? Is it when the letter of intent is signed or when the contract is signed? And also, do contracts usually require an initial deposit?
All right, so every transition process is different. I would say not until formal contracts are signed, right? Letters of intent are great because they organize everybody's thoughts. They make sure everybody's on the same page, but they are of no legal effect. They cannot be enforced. They are not contracts, right? But understanding that the starting point of a transition is likely execution of the contract. Once you sign the contract, in all likelihood, this deal is going to close unless something goes drastically wrong. So that's a time when you can start that transition process. And it may be shadowing, it may just be, having some, conversations over a meal, something along those lines. And again, you don't turn over the actual responsibility until after the transaction closes. But I think you can feel comfortable, and I've expressed that level of comfort to my clients that once you have contracts signed, you can begin that process. I mean, with respect to an earnest money deposit, something along those lines, I mean, it depends, right? If it's a deal that calls for maybe 80% third-party financing, and there's some obligation that 20% come directly from the seller, we may require that to be placed in escrow, just so we know the funds are available, and there's not going to be any last-minute surprises pre-closing. But short of that, it's not something that it's probably 50-50. And normally that deposit, it's not like it's going to be written in the contract that if you, walk away from the deal that they get to, you get to keep the deposit. That's not something I normally see. It's just going to sit in an attorney's trust account until closing.
All right. Are you able to advise in the buying or selling of podiatric practices located in Canada?
I can't.
And I haven't. So and I don't know, I don't have a working knowledge of the healthcare system there. If it's an all cash transaction, we could probably TV timeout. I'm not going to say we probably could. I'm going to say we would have to review and understand and investigate to be sure that it's appropriate for us to do that.
All right. This is our last question. We made it.
We made it.
When you discuss EBITDA, whatever that is, do you include salary of podiatrists as an expense that reduces earnings? If so, what is a standard amount for a salary?
Well, you have to make the adjustment between what actual salary is and what normalized earnings is for a doctor. So generally, you can do it two ways. You can go and look at MGMA, Medical Group Management Association. They will tell you that normalized earnings for 3-year surgically trained doctor is between 175 and 225. So that, or you can say that the percentage amount for an owner should be no less than 35, no higher than 45, but somewhere in that range. So you can take what they're actually making less what's normalized, that remainder, and take it that it's a positive, that they're making more than those percentages, that gets added back to the net cash flow of the business. It's really a tricky question to answer because you can't just take the salary out and include all that cash flow, because at some point the new owner is going to have to be paid. So you got to make it a net number. So I didn't answer it, but it's really difficult to get to it at this point.
All right, so that answers all of our questions. So we did get a lot of questions about whether or not the recording will be available, and yes, it will be. An email should go out tomorrow with the recording for this, and then once we get the list of recommended credentialing companies, we'll send that out, and anything else that was requested. Like I said before, you should have been redirected to a web page that had a little form on it where you could fill out your name and contact information if you have any specific questions, so that the team from Provider Resources and John can reach out to you. also in the recording email tomorrow, in the confirmation for that, they'll have all their email addresses, so you can contact them directly.
Awesome.
Well, I would like to thank John and Bruce both for joining us. I'd like to thank Podiatry Meetings for doing such an excellent job of moderating and coordinating the meeting. Excuse me, y'all do a great job with this and I really do appreciate it. Oh, that's right. I'm going to be at the Podiatry Meetings booth at the APMA National Meeting in July on Friday afternoon. And I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to be at the booth starting at 1:30 that day. It'll be the first full day of the exhibit hall being open. The exhibit hall will be open from 9 to 4 that day or something like that. But I'll be at their booth starting at 1:30. So if you're on this call and you want to come by and talk, or we'll have some time there, but I meant to mention that earlier and didn't, but we'll put it in a communication to you. But I want to thank them for their hospitality and their hard work of making this happen.
Well,
Thank you very much.
absolutely. Yes, we're happy to have you guys. This is obviously a well-needed, session because it's one of our most well-attended. So if you are going to be at the APMA National in Nashville, we would love to have you stop by our booth every day because we have exciting things happening every day. But specifically Friday for sure, if you would like to chat with Mike, he'll be there Friday afternoon, like he said. And hopefully you're getting all of our emails about like our upcoming academy sessions and all the different fun things that we are doing. If you don't get our emails, maybe you found this event through somebody else's social media or something like that, just send us a note to the email address that's been in all the Zoom communications, and we will get you added. That way you don't miss out on anything exciting happening in the future.
Absolutely. There's also a sign up form on our website at podiatrymeetings.com, newsletters.
Yeah. So thank you guys. Thanks for staying with us all night. And thank you guys for preparing this and staying with us and answering all these questions. And we look forward to the next one.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you
Everybody
so
have a
much,
good evening.
everybody.
Good
Have a
night.
great
Thank you guys. Bye.